One thing that you'll see around different parts of Oklahoma are big tree windbreaks, and here to talk a little bit about those and help us kind of give us some tips and guidelines on those windbreaks is Terry Bidwell. Terry, let's talk about those windbreaks. They were put in quite a few years ago and really to help with wind erosion.
Yeah, windbreaks are the result of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s and agriculture policy. Back then, people had small equipment. It took a long time to get over a field, and wind erosion was a big issue. Nowadays, it's not. We've got big equipment. We've got no-till, minimum-till type equipment, so windbreaks are really not necessary anymore.
Okay. In their day, did they do any good?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they did what, you know, there's some really neat old documents that show how much they actually went out and measured. So say the wind's coming from here, here's a windbreak that says 30 feet tall, how much is the wind reduced out so many feet, and they measure, you know, it's a 70% reduction out for 60 feet, and they've got data that shows the height of the windbreak. Most windbreaks were like 3 rows. They might have 2 rows of trees and 1 row of shrubs, and then there's been 5-row windbreaks. One of the downfalls of windbreaks were the root zone would move out into the crop field, and farmers would see a reduction in crop yield for a pretty good ways out, and they didn't like that. So they got into trying to root plow to try to cut the roots off to get more production, and sometimes that'd kill that row. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Whether they're necessary or not, a lot of people still have them. Is there anything that they need to do from a management perspective to keep those healthy, and what kinds of things should they be looking at?
Sure, a lot of these windbreaks are 60 years old or older, 60, 70, 80 maybe, and so some of these trees die over time, so a windbreak becomes less effective if some of the trees die. So there's certainly issues with going in and replanting those. The key is you do not want to plant invasive species or things that spread from there and cause problems.
Yeah, one thing that we're seeing here are some red cedars that are in this windbreak, and that's a big problem.
Red cedar, you can look at aerial photography and see where red cedar radiate out from windbreaks, and that's a big problem. Of course, if people are burning, that's really not an issue, but some areas they don't burn and the red cedar is spreading. Another big issue is Russian olive. It very impacts riparian zones, waterways all over eastern Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, New Mexico. Big water user, real negative impact from Russian olive.
Okay. What kind of trees should you plant into a windbreak if you're going to replant and put some new ones in?
Well, you're putting trees in a prairie environment, which is very hostile to trees anyway, so you need something that's very resilient. And there's been a lot of research, and they have a good selection of trees that aren't invasive that can survive. A big part of windbreak establishment is weed barriers and drip irrigation to get them started. If you don't do that, it's pretty hard to get them going.
Pretty hard to do it. And what about wildlife? We do find that a lot of these windbreaks will provide some wildlife habitat.
Windbreaks provide primarily wildlife habitat to wildlife that aren't native to the prairies. And for example, white-tailed deer will use a windbreak, pheasant will use a windbreak, some songbirds will use windbreaks, but the native prairie wildlife don't use those windbreaks. And in fact, windbreaks actually exclude them from using a prairie area if it's out there in the middle of it.
Okay, so I guess the story on windbreaks is if you've got them, they are going to take some management. Make sure you know what kind of species that you're going to be planting are in that windbreak, and just try to keep them together, I guess.
Sure.
Okay, appreciate it, Terry. Thank you very much.